Well, hello again, folks. Today we move into chapter 8 of 2 Corinthians. And this is a really encouraging chapter because it's all about the idea of giving. So Paul had previously talked about the collection for God's people in 1 Corinthians, and now he brings it up again. And just to be clear here, the giving to the Lord's people was a specific cause that many churches were collecting for, churches that Paul had been in contact with, and really all over the show. It was a collection for the poor people in Jerusalem, those who had hardly anything to their name. And all of these churches across the Middle East and into Asia were giving money and sending it then to the believers in Jerusalem to be distributed as they saw need. Now, we might expect Paul to make an appeal and say something like, oh, and please make sure you set aside some money for the poor. But that's not really the case here. Instead, Paul lays down some basic principles in order to put a kind of structure on how people give money to a particular cause. And what we see here is, well, principles that Paul lays down that are really helpful. So Paul starts by drawing the Corinthians' attention to the example of the Macedonian churches. He says they have given so generously, it's mind-blowing. And the reason why it's so mind-blowing is because they themselves had been going through really difficult trials. Paul even says they are living in extreme poverty, and yet they're still able to give generously. And the interesting thing here is Paul describes in verse 1 that this is a grace of God. So God's grace was so at work within these Macedonian churches that they were able to give despite their circumstances of poverty. They were overjoyed even, Paul says, as they gave. How incredible is that? The Lord's grace had taken captive of their hearts so much that they were actually freed entirely from the desire to cling to money. The little they had, they gave, and they did it out of joy. And so Paul then urges the Corinthians to learn from their example. He reminds the Corinthians in verse 7, you're excelling in loads of different areas of congregational life, faith, speech, knowledge, and so on and so on. But you should also be excelling in this area as well. This isn't just a wee add-on. It doesn't really matter as much. This is important. It's vital for churches to give to the work of the Lord and to remember the poor in particular. Those who do not have what others have. Those who struggle to survive each and every day. Everywhere Paul goes, he's encouraging this kind of attitude because remember, he himself knows what it's like to have nothing, to be in hunger, to have no money, and he's encouraging a culture of giving and giving to the poor. But it's under certain conditions, and that's vital. Giving is never meant to be like a strain, a burden, a struggle in the hearts and lives of believers. Paul doesn't demand that, just every Christian is to give exactly 10 grand every single year to the poor. No, he knows people could not bear that kind of thing. So in this passage, he gives instructions that people can bear. And there's 4 just general principles that come out of this. So firstly, it's just, I suppose the very general principle of being generous. He's talking about attitude. Look to be generous, he's saying. Don't make money your idol. Look for ways that you can bless others by giving. Have a generosity in your spirit. Secondly, this is not a command. Rather, it should be an expression of your love and as a result of God's grace in your life. So this is not a command that you must follow. I have to do this because God says so. It's an expression of love for God, love for others, and it's a result of God's grace being so evident in your life. Thirdly, give so that there is equality among believers, is what Paul says. So don't give to the point where your church has nothing and other churches around you have loads of stuff. Give to the point of equality, where if you are struggling, others will actually give to you. And if you have a bit to give and others are in need, then do so. Fourthly, be willing. Don't do it grudgingly. Don't give if you're not happy to do it. Rather, be willing to give in the knowledge that others desperately need it. And those are kind of the 4 general principles that Paul sets up when it comes to giving to the collection for the Lord's people. And of course then, all of this is in the context of verse 9. Hopefully you noticed verse 9, beautiful verse in the middle of this passage, recognizing what God has so graciously done for us. Paul says Jesus was rich. He had total togetherness and harmony with the Father, and yet he became poor for our sakes. That is, he took on separation from God himself in order to pay the price for our sins. And in so doing, we became rich, not in terms of money, of course, but in terms of relationship. Our relationship with the Lord was repaired. No more separation for us. Rather, we had reconciliation with the Father. So what we could say is Jesus went from riches to poverty in terms of his connection with the Father, so that we could go from poverty to riches in terms of our righteousness before the Lord. Amazing stuff. And on that note, we finish chapter 8. Join us Monday then as Paul continues talking about this particular topic into chapter 9. Until then, though, have a good weekend and God bless.